I can breathe.
8 minutes and 46 life-changing seconds in May sparked a continuing nationwide movement.
Miami Valley Voices soon joined racial justice and police reform calls.
It's time for them to come up with some solutions.
But more than 2 months after George Floyd's death, what has changed?
Today, NewsCenter7 presents a comprehensive community conversation.
That we can set a model for our state to follow.
What is happening with possible law changes?
The whole criminal justice system needs to be looked at.
As some in law enforcement urge caution.
That doesn't mean that they're going to be good things.
The answers emerging Miami Valley leaders are looking for.
To build meaningful relationships within our community.
And the often complicated role black officers find themselves in.
At the end of the day, I'm an African-American male.
During this time, a time of the public demanding change. It's been 65 days, more than 9 weeks since George Floyd died while in police custody, I should say, and sparked a demand for change against injustice and racism. For this NewsCenter7 special edition, I'm James Brown.
I'm Cheryl McHenry. Initially, protesters' demands for a renewed examination of police practices produced reform promises, but also since May, physical changes like monuments, statues, and flags coming down. Over the next half an hour, we'll add perspective on where we find ourselves now. My conversation with 3 veteran Dayton African-American officers, and later, Ronell Hunt introduces us to the next generation of leaders. But we begin live Team 7 coverage with key legislative developments. In just minutes, Blair Miller joins us from our D.C. newsroom. But first, the I-Team's Jim Oddie has learned there's now a potential holdup at the state capitol. Jim?
Even in the midst of the COVID crisis and the economic slide that came with it, some of this legislation that we're talking about here for social justice and police reforms in the wake of the death of George Floyd, that was making advances. However, what happened next? That's troubling. The federal investigation, the charges against top politicians here, the arrest of the House Speaker, that's what's bringing this all to a halt, potentially a slight delay or even completely stopping it altogether, this legislation in the demand for change. After protesters took to Columbus streets, their anger and frustration over George Floyd's death sometimes boiled over into property damage, including the State House and historic buildings, with a lot of push from advocates and caution from some others. The movement for lasting social justice and police reform changes was slowly moving forward at the Capitol. And then this happened.
We're here today to announce the arrest of Larry Householder, the Speaker of the House of the State of Ohio, and 4 other defendants.
Politically, the massive State House scandal, the FBI investigation targeting House Speaker Larry Householder.
Speaker Householder, what do you have to say to Ohioans?
Not at this time.
It's thrown all legislative business into a tailspin.
The whole criminal justice system needs to be looked at.
Now in limbo, the police reform plan, state NAACP president and former lawmaker from here, Tom Roberts, is pushing for. He and others want more transparency and accountability, one that prevents officers who mistreat people and disregard the rules from escaping discipline by simply quitting and getting a job in another department.
An officer should not be allowed to resign if he's in disciplinary mode. That information should follow him or her to the next job.
That's where former Montgomery County Sheriff Phil Plummer comes in. Plummer's now a state representative here and has introduced a reform plan that in part does try to stop officers from easily relocating when they're in trouble.
It happens a lot, Jim, and we need to target that group of people. You know, it's the actors that continually get in trouble at your department. And if you can eventually fire them, they still have their police certificate and they can go jump from department to department.
Both Plummer and Governor Mike DeWine want to create a system that better controls a certificate or license for each officer that can be removed by the state. Plummer also wants a statewide discipline database, and officers' record will follow them wherever they go. Plummer says when he was sheriff, the union contract required any notice of discipline in someone's personnel file to be made secret with the passage of time.
Discipline's sealed after a year, so the discipline's sealed and nobody can touch it. So there's a lot of loopholes there that we need to correct so we can expose this bad behavior.
Current police chiefs want the discipline database, too, so they can check out people applying for a job.
When we do have that issue that
we have some type of vetting system, that they're not just going somewhere else within the state of Ohio.
Springfield Police Chief Lee Graff is encouraged by what he's heard so far from the State House. He cautions, though, any more requirements that don't come with funding won't help much.
We might have funding available for 1 year that might do something like body cameras, and purchasing body cameras is great, and it saves a municipality a lot of money, but there are ongoing costs to maintaining that system.
Graff also worries about what's going to work within employee contracts. The State Fraternal Order of Police says there's already a lot of accountability, but they're open to reforms.
You can change a lot of things, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be good things that come of that. So our goal is to make sure that whatever comes out of this process is fair to everyone involved, and it's a good process.
With the scandal, though, the odds of getting a law passed this year are much less now. Best case scenario, the DeWine administration could make some administrative changes, and even if somehow a new law is passed, the real change won't come quickly.
It would be my expectation that it would be at least a year to 2 years before it was fully implemented and operational.
Still, Tom Roberts is urging lawmakers not to get distracted by the householder investigation, but to pass a plan while the memory of George Floyd is fresh on our minds, and the call for change is still strong.
The General Assembly members need to see and feel the pain that their constituents are feeling and put these laws into effect now.
Right now here at the State House, a lot of the focus is all on replacing the current Speaker of the Ohio House. He'll be taken out of that position tomorrow morning at a special House session. And then they may go back to their regular schedule. That schedule right now says they won't be back in session until September or October. There's a chance they won't come back and do any real business until after the election in November. Whatever happens, we'll have it all covered for you. We're live at the State House in Columbus. Jim Oddie, NewsCenter7.
All right, Jim, and we have a NewsCenter7 exclusive with the father of the African-American man an officer shot and killed at the Beaver Creek Walmart in 2014. This happened while they were investigating a report of a man pointing a gun at women and children inside the store. John Crawford III's father told Mike Campbell the change he is pushing for is how officers are trained to respond to calls. An investigation found John Crawford III was carrying a pellet gun he found outside the box on the store shelf. Surveillance did not show Crawford point the weapon at anyone. No one faced criminal charges in this case. Crawford III would have turned 28 today. His dad plans to be back in Ohio next week, 6 years to the day his son died.
It's clear that if you're not at imminent risk of danger, you're not supposed to engage in deadly force, period. So some of that, it's in there, and we're just simply not enforcing. That's the issue.
The Crawford family shares their story with our Mike Campbell live right now on WHIO.com and WHIO TV now. Our streaming apps are free to download on your Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and Smart TV App Store. At NewsCenter7's Blair Miller continues our live Team 7 coverage from D.C., looking at where Democratic and Republican federal police reform bills stand at this point. Blair, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, James. And much like Jim is reporting there in Ohio, right now these bills really are at a standstill as the focus here in D.C. turns toward coronavirus relief. Lawmakers are scrambling to solve one big problem after the next before their August recess.
It's an issue that both Democrats and Republicans agree needs to change, the relationship between communities of color and law enforcement. But for some on Capitol Hill, that's where the agreement stops. Last month, the Democratic Majority House passed the Justice and Policing Act, which would create a national police misconduct registry. It would also ban chokeholds and no-knock warrants at the federal level.
This bold, transformative legislation will assist police departments to change the culture of policing.
But members of the GOP had their own plan in mind. Republican senators, spearheaded by Tim Scott of South Carolina, introduced their own bill called the Justice Act. Senate Democrats voted to block all debate on that bill. Now, both bills remain stagnant. With no agreement in sight, some states are taking it upon themselves to create change. In Connecticut, lawmakers are working on a bill that would get rid of qualified immunity for officers. And Iowa's governor signed a law banning most police chokeholds. Calls for reform continuing across the country, while many D.C. lawmakers remain frustrated.
We'll forget about this. We'll move on. People will forget about it. And you know what's going to happen? Something bad. And we'll be right back here talking about what should have been done, what could have been done, why we must act now.
Blair's back with us live in D.C. I'm curious, what are Ohio lawmakers saying? What are you hearing, Blair?
Exactly, James. So we reached out to both of our senators, and both agreed change is needed in policing. Senator Brown's calling for the entire public safety system to be transformed. Senator Portman says both sides need to work together on this, but you have Democrats calling for a complete overhaul and Republicans making changes to policies. So there's a lot of ground between the two when it comes to looking at real change on this topic. James?
All right, Blair Miller reporting live for us this afternoon from D.C. Blair, thanks.
When I put this uniform on, when I take it off, at the end of the day, I'm an African-American male.
African Americans who also work in law enforcement can find themselves in the middle of the demand for change debate. Next, 3 perspectives as we examine why there are so few people of color on area forces.
If you want change within the police department, be a police officer.
Every police reform plan calls for more racially diverse law enforcement, but that simple goal has been an uphill challenge for decades. It is a challenge many officers know, and as I learned from 3 veteran black officers, getting more young men and women of color interested in a law enforcement career is a very complicated issue. As we watched racial justice and police reform protests from Minneapolis
my family built that community
to here in the Miami Valley, the scenes often mirror separate protester and police sides.
When I put this uniform on, when I take it off, at the end of the day, I'm an African-American male.
For African-American officers, like Montgomery County Chief Deputy Sheriff Darrell Wilson, those scenes are personally complex.
When I put this uniform on, I'm law enforcement, but this uniform doesn't make me. I make this uniform.
Me as a black man, I don't want to be labeled, and me as a police officer, I don't want to be labeled.
A complexity Dayton Assistant Police Chief Eric Henderson and 20-year veteran Dayton officer Letha Savage deeply understand based on their lived experiences.
Growing up in a black home, black brothers, black sisters, cousins, aunts, I even asked, I'm like, has anybody ever thought of being a police officer? And it was like, why? No.
It can be difficult. Sometimes community members may see you as being on an opposing side, but at the same time, for the most part, what citizens are asking for, the black community is asking for, I'm trying to do.
Henderson is a Dayton native. Wilson grew up in Los Angeles, Savage in Florida. Wilson and Savage say single mothers raising them is key in their life perspectives. So are mostly positive early community policing impressions.
I would do things that I was supposed to be doing, so law enforcement back in those days would take me home, and I would get it from my mom. And I wish that never did take place after she got a hold of me. But
a DARE officer came to the school, and I actually rode in a cruiser with the DARE officer going around schools talking about why kids shouldn't use drugs.
We had a police department, like on Sundays, it was nothing for police officers to come have Sunday dinner at your house.
Just one of 3 black female DPD officers, Savage was on the front lines during recent protests.
One young man kept saying, "You look like my mom. You could be my mom." And I was like, what does that mean? I said, what does that mean? And then he said, I should never put this uniform on again. And I said, if I didn't put this uniform on again, your mom wouldn't be on the department.
There's a renewed push for more women and minorities in uniform as citizens demand law enforcement better reflect the communities they serve. And there's a long way to go. Dayton's police department has 370 officers. 26 of them are black. That's 7% in a city whose population is 43% black. The sheriff's office has 203 sworn officers, 11 of whom are black. That's only about 5%. Montgomery County's population is 21% black.
And we're looking for new ideas, and we're looking for people who's energized.
To beef up those numbers, both departments launched recruiting campaigns aimed at minorities. They feature billboard ads and slickly produced videos showcasing officers' different duties. But these veteran officers believe the first hurdle is overcoming the mistrust among people of color toward police.
Well, I get called names from my people. other people of color. Because I am a law enforcement.
Wilson gets it. He recalls traveling out of state, out of uniform, and a white officer approaching him, using what he perceived to be a racial slur.
Okay, maybe he calls everybody boy, but that's not cool. But okay, I get it. Or maybe because I was a black, he's calling me boy. And you see even law enforcement say, well, what can we do to help you with this movement? Because you know what? Good cops hate bad cops.
Negative police interactions are also a part of Henderson's family conversations. He feels it's important for all sides to listen.
A lot of times as an officer, you forget the power and the potential impact you have over someone's life when you're interacting with them and how that person may feel.
My life is no different than anybody else's life.
Just like the officers she grew up with, Savage advocates for more Black and Hispanic community outreach, and she's partnering with Dayton Public Schools to connect with students.
And we're going to give them the opportunity to interact with police on a regular basis, to see us as the human beings that we are. If you want change within the police department, be a police officer.
Well, you just heard our piece with 3 African-American officers who talked about having early positive interactions with officers, help leading them to this profession. And now we're talking to Dr. Patrick Oliver from Cedarville University. You're the director of the criminal justice program there and a former police chief in Cleveland and Fairborn. Dr. Oliver, is that what we need to do to recruit more minority officers, get police to engage with young kids in high school, middle school?
Yes, that's what we need to do. It's interesting, the comments of the officers, because both majority culture and minority culture officers, most of them will tell you they had positive early interaction with law enforcement officers. In fact, that's my history. I'm a blue blood, a second-generation law enforcement officer. So I grew up with law enforcement officers around the house who were friends of my dad, and so that positively impacted me. And so law enforcement agencies, if they want to recruit more minorities, need to develop a positive relationship with the communities of colors before they start to recruit them.
Some people are proposing that we do away with qualified immunity. I heard in Blair Miller's package that Connecticut's talking about that. That would shield officers, when it's in place, it shields officers from personal liability if they're charged with excessive force, for instance. Are we going to be able to attract people to law enforcement if we don't have qualified immunity for them?
Cheryl, let me say this. Qualified immunity is based on 2 things. 1, did the law enforcement officer violate a constitutional right? And 2, was that constitutional right established? Both have to be the case. If the answer is no to either one of those questions, then that officer can claim qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is wrapped up in the philosophy of fairness. It's not fair to a law enforcement officer to have them be liable potentially for a monetary suit when either there wasn't a constitutional right violated, or second, it wasn't clearly established. And so if qualified immunity is taken away, it certainly will negatively impact people who would otherwise consider a career in law enforcement.
All right. Thank you for your answers, Dr. Oliver. We appreciate you joining us for this special.
There's this agonizing wait. When are we going to see change?
It is the question many emerging as the leaders in our local demand for change movement are working to answer by looking to John Lewis's example next. In Congressman John Lewis's honor last weekend, the Black National Anthem was sung, part of the Civil Rights Pioneers' Selma, Alabama Memorial Service. And a lyric in that song reads, "Let us march on till victory is won." And in that spirit, NewsCenter7's Renell Hunt introduces us to some of those emerging as our local demand for change leaders and what Lewis's influence meant to them.
This weekend, a final passage over Selma, Alabama's Edmund Pettus Bridge came full circle. More than 55 years after Congressman John Lewis almost died here fighting for civil rights.
Do you see that this wonderful man lived 80 years of life and did all of this work, and we get to put him down as a hero, and a lot of people didn't know him. And so then this is this great thing that we get to tap into.
A great racial justice reminder. Daytonians like Asia Gibbs, now leading her own Miami Valley civil rights movement, are using as an important reminder.
A lot of times this can be extremely tiring. And so for him to be able to take that activism work and turn it into becoming a part of our lawmaking system and getting different acts and pushing forward for our people is such a beautiful thing.
John would take time to sit and talk with anybody about anything they had to talk about.
From his role as the former international president for predominantly African-American fraternity Phi Beta Sigma, Carter Womack, who had a long-time friendship with Lewis from his home in Columbus, said paying it forward for young people was always the congressman's focus.
And he felt very strongly that having that conversation with this generation, who would then become the next generation, would understand the importance of them being engaged and committed to be one activist at whatever level they need to be.
It's time for them to come up with some solutions. No justice, no peace. No.
I first met Gibbs peacefully protesting the weekend after George Floyd was killed. The next day, her life changed. She stopped to move to Atlanta and created the Solution Movement. She spent the last couple of months leading her own peaceful protests and encouraging honest dialogues between different races.
My goal right now is to build meaningful relationships within our community, with the lawmakers, with the police, and with our literal community, and changing that relationship.
That, in a way, is a shared goal of other young black Daytonians who've emerged as leaders. But it goes deeper. Deja Deming's Politics for Social Justice initiative focuses on creating a Dayton Young Black Professionals Institute.
To be trained to represent West Dayton in the local, state, and federal level.
Can I get a honk if you love West Dayton?
For Chaz Amos, his focus after George Floyd's death turned into a 15-week initiative to clean up and beautify West Dayton.
In the next 5-10 years, we won't have to wait on something bad to happen to come out and clean up the community. We won't have to wait on something bad to happen to go out and talk to our neighbor and help our neighbor.
And there's also an important economic focus for business owners like Shantae Winston.
And I just want to take everybody by the hand who I see working hard and need some help getting their brand pushed out and just be their hero.
Because we all have human rights. We all have civil rights. And that's what John Lewis stood for.
Dayton NAACP President Derek Fulward feels Montgomery County leaders are on the right track to set a state criminal justice and police reform example.
I believe it's going to serve as a model that is going to inspire.
A model that Asia Gibbs' children helped shape her commitment to when demanding change. A recent experience where she had to warn her 10-year-old son about not playing with a toy gun outside is significant in understanding her personal mission.
There's this agonizing weight. When are we going to see change?
A question John Lewis worked his entire life toward answering. After this weekend's final passage, Alabama state troopers answered in sharp contrast to 1965, this time saluting Lewis's casket. Ron L. Hunt, NewsCenter7.
And the last half hour was just part of an ongoing demand for change community dialogue NewsCenter7 is committed to continuing.
Live right now on our streaming WHIO TV Now app, you'll find extended interviews featuring multiple perspectives from some of those you heard from today. That is a free download on your Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and Smart TV App Store. Thank you for watching A Demand for Change.
NewsCenter7 at 6 is next.